Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. I sat in the kitchen that evening, a quiet tension simmering beneath the surface as I watched my wife, Melanie, buzz around, clearing plates from the table. It was an ordinary Thursday night, dinner over, the kids already headed to their rooms, a nightly ritual we'd perfected over 10 years of marriage. But tonight, a dark unease settled in my chest. Melanie had changed. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that I could almost convince myself it was nothing. But the things I'd brushed off as work stress or simple tiredness were starting to look more like detachment, distance. The long silences, the hurried, absent-minded responses, the missed dinner conversations. And then there were the late nights. It began with an occasional delay, the odd work meeting, but had evolved into frequent absences, her coming home well after I'd gone to bed. I'd asked her about it, of course. She would respond with the same familiar refrain, her tone just a bit too rehearsed. "It's just work. We're swamped right now." And then she'd plaster on a weak smile and look away, never quite meeting my gaze. There was a time I would have shrugged it off. 10 years into marriage, I'd stopped expecting every moment to feel romantic or even enjoyable. But now, a strange nagging feeling crept into my mind, a disquiet I couldn't shake. A few days later, my suspicions deepened. Melanie had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower. She wasn't one to be careless with her phone, especially lately. It was usually with her, like an extension of her own hand. As I walked by, the screen lit up with a message. The message wasn't long, but it was enough to twist a knife in my gut. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." The sender's name was simply Ryan. My stomach tightened as I looked away from the screen, pretending I hadn't seen it, even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. My mind reeled with denial, then anger, then a strange, bitter acceptance. This was my life, my reality now. My wife was cheating on me. And what was worse, she was lying to my face. She came back down to the kitchen, her hair damp from the shower, a fresh look on her face that somehow made the situation even more painful. She glanced at her phone and froze for a moment, and then picked it up, her thumb quickly swiping over the message as she put it back into her pocket. When she looked at me, her face was unreadable, neutral, as though nothing had happened. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. The usual soft rhythms of our house, the creak of the walls settling, the hum of the refrigerator, became sharp and invasive. I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried to calm my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, the message from Ryan flashed in my mind. My chest burned with a quiet fury. The anger was new, foreign, and it felt potent, like something I needed to hold on to stay grounded. The days that followed were an exercise in restraint. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed to be certain. I had to know the truth, every last detail. I started noticing everything. I began cataloging her behavior, noting how her laughter seemed hollow, how she avoided eye contact, how she had taken to staying out later than usual. She didn't give me much, but I gathered enough, subtle confirmations that this was no mistake. Then, I took it a step further. I'd been keeping track of her schedule for weeks, and I knew she had a business trip scheduled. That was when I knew I'd get the answers I needed. The morning of her trip arrived, and I kissed her goodbye, managing to keep my face neutral even though the simple gesture felt like an emotional betrayal. She left in a rush, as if glad to be gone, a hasty goodbye that felt more real than any goodbye she'd given in years. Once she'd left, I went to work, but my mind was elsewhere the entire day, tracking her every move in my imagination. That night, I searched the house, going through every drawer, every forgotten crevice, every bit of her life that she'd once shared with me. That's when I found the other phone. Hidden in a drawer of her office desk, a place I rarely had reason to go. It was an older model, a bit beat up and scratched, but as I turned it on, I found what I needed. The phone was filled with messages. Conversations that made me recoil in disgust and disbelief. Messages filled with innuendo, details of late-night meetups, plans, memories of things they'd done together. As I read them, the memories of my marriage, my life with Melanie, unraveled, each word cutting away the illusion I'd held on to for so long. I put the phone back, my hands trembling with rage and hurt, my mind filled with the overwhelming urge to confront her, to shatter the lies. But that wouldn't be enough. She'd hurt me, broken me in a way I didn't think possible, and I was going to make her understand the consequences of her betrayal. I didn't confront her right away, not even after discovering that second phone and the graphic evidence of her betrayal. Instead, I spent the next week plotting my response. Rage was there, simmering just below the surface, but I knew that if I let it out too soon, it would only lead to shouting and accusations, maybe a half-hearted apology. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted her to see how deeply she had hurt me. I wanted her to feel the same sense of betrayal and heartbreak she had inflicted on me, the same sense of utter devastation that filled my chest each night when I closed my eyes and thought of the man she was sneaking off to meet. No, I wasn't going to let her get away with just a fight. I was going to dismantle her life, piece by piece. One evening, I sat alone in our office, formulating the plan. I called a lawyer, an old friend who owed me a favor. He walked me through the legal steps, what I could do, what I couldn't, and how to document everything without giving her any ground to fight back. By the end of the call, I had a solid idea of how to move forward, one that would leave her no room to squirm out or plead innocence. The first step was simple enough. I started gathering evidence. I went through the phone I'd found, documenting every message, every damning detail, and saving copies to my personal email. I sifted through our financial records, looking for any unusual expenses or charges. I even looked through our home security footage, noting her late-night arrivals and early morning departures, building up a timeline of her deceit. The hardest part was keeping up appearances. Every day, I had to look her in the eye and pretend everything was fine. I had to sit across from her at the dinner table, listen to her talk about her day, and bite back the urge to confront her. Every laugh, every casual touch, every forced smile grated against the raw wound in my chest. But I knew that revealing my hand too early would ruin everything. I had to bide my time. One night, a couple of weeks into my quiet campaign, I couldn't resist testing her. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV show, and she looked relaxed, her head resting back as if she hadn't a care in the world. I decided to see if I could get her to lie to me outright, to see if she would keep up the charade even if I hinted at the truth. "Hey, Mel," I said casually, keeping my voice as light as possible. "So, Ryan. He's your coworker, right?" She froze for a fraction of a second, so brief it was almost imperceptible. Then she laughed, a quick, breathless sound, too high-pitched to be genuine. "Yeah," she said, glancing at me with a forced smile. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, I just thought I heard you mention his name the other day. Thought it was funny. I didn't think you had any Ryans at work." She shrugged, turning back to the TV, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. "Yeah, he's just a guy from the office. Nothing special." I felt a surge of satisfaction. The lie was so obvious, so flimsy, and I could see the strain it took her to keep up the facade. She didn't look at me for the rest of the evening, staying fixed on the screen, her jaw clenched ever so slightly. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Good. Let her wonder, let her feel that gnawing unease. By the following weekend, I was ready for the next phase. Melanie had another work trip coming up, and I knew exactly where she would be, the same city she'd visited during her last affair-fueled getaway. I told her to have a safe trip, kissed her goodbye with the same placid smile I'd been wearing for weeks, and watched her drive off, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Once she was gone, I began setting the stage. I contacted her friends, even her family, under the guise of organizing a surprise party for our anniversary. I wanted them all to be in town when everything unraveled, to see the truth for themselves, to understand what she had done. The idea of her trying to explain her way out of it in front of her closest friends and family gave me a grim satisfaction. While she was away, I went through every last detail of our home, stripping it of anything that wasn't mine. I packed up her clothes, her jewelry, her books, and everything else that reminded me of her presence, boxing it up and leaving it in the garage. I wanted her to come home to an empty house, to feel the absence of the life she had thrown away. When she came back a few days later, I was ready. I watched from the kitchen window as she pulled into the driveway, her face tired but serene, as if she hadn't a care in the world. She stepped out of the car and headed for the front door, fumbling with her keys as if she'd just returned from an ordinary business trip. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension and anticipation coil within me. She opened the door and stepped inside, looking around in confusion at the half-empty living room, the shelves stripped of her books, her family photos gone. "Jake," she called, her voice uncertain. I stepped out of the kitchen, meeting her gaze with a calm expression. "Welcome home, Mel," I said. She looked around, her confusion deepening. What's going on?" "Oh, nothing much," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just a few adjustments." Her eyes flicked to the boxes stacked against the wall, and I saw a flicker of panic cross her face. "Jake, what is this?" I crossed my arms, watching her carefully. "You tell me, Melanie. Or should I call Ryan and ask him directly?" Her face went pale, her mouth dropping open as she struggled to find words. She stammered, starting to deny it, to try to explain, but I shook my head, silencing her with a look. "I know everything, Melanie. I've known for weeks." Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her as she looked down at the floor. "Jake, I'm so sorry." "Save it," I cut in, my voice cold. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase the messages, the lies, the betrayal. I trusted you. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." She tried to reach for me, her eyes desperate, but I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. I could see the realization dawning on her, the slow, crushing awareness of what she had lost. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, my tone final. "The divorce papers are ready. You'll be hearing from him soon." Tears filled her eyes, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no pity. Only a cold, grim satisfaction as I watched her world crumble, just as she had shattered mine. She tried to speak, to plead, but I turned away, leaving her standing there, alone in the empty house that was no longer hers. I stayed at a hotel that night, letting Melanie sit alone with the reality of her actions. I imagined her moving through the house, room by room, opening the closets and drawers to find the hollow spaces where her belongings had once been. I hoped she would feel the emptiness as deeply as I had in those nights when I lay awake, tortured by thoughts of her with someone else. The next day, I returned to the house with my lawyer, Robert. He was there to oversee the transition, making sure I didn't leave myself vulnerable to any of her last-ditch attempts to stall or drag things out. Robert had known me for years, and though he'd offered support, he kept things professional. I appreciated that, it kept me grounded. When I walked through the door, Melanie was there, looking like she hadn't slept. She had barely moved since I'd left, just sitting at the kitchen table, her face hollow and tear-streaked. Seeing her like that should have brought some satisfaction, some twisted form of justice, but instead, I felt only a strange emptiness, a void where my anger had once burned hot. I nodded to Robert, who stepped aside as I approached her. "We're here to finalize some things," I said, my tone flat. She looked up, eyes red and pleading, but there was no fire left in me for her tears. "Jake, please. Can't we talk about this?" "We're way past talking, Mel." I set down the folder Robert had prepared. "I tried to talk for months. I gave you every chance to come clean, to be honest with me. But you kept lying, even when you didn't have to. She swallowed, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't even know how it got this far. It was a mistake. Stop. I held up a hand, refusing to let her finish. Don't try to make this smaller than it is. This wasn't just some slip-up or misunderstanding. You chose this. Over and over, you chose this. The silence between us felt heavy, the weight of 10 years of shared memories hanging in the air. I remembered our wedding day, the first time we brought our son home from the hospital, our late-night talks about dreams we'd had for each other and our family. It felt like a lifetime ago. That person, the one who had held her hand through it all, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Robert cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Melanie, the papers are straightforward. The divorce will be uncontested. Jake has been more than fair with the arrangements, especially given the circumstances. I saw her eyes flicker with desperation, and I could tell she was looking for a way out, something to grab hold of. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice low and trembling. Jake, please, can we try counseling? One last time. I closed my eyes, gathering the strength to stay composed. Counseling? You want counseling now? I shook my head. Where was that suggestion months ago, before you stepped out on our marriage? Before you decided that I wasn't enough? She flinched, and for a second, I saw a flash of anger in her eyes, as if she wanted to fight back, to argue that somehow this was my fault. But the words seemed to die on her lips. She looked away, defeated. I turned to Robert, who handed her a pen and the divorce papers. Sign these, Melanie. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can both move on. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen, hovering over the papers. Her eyes met mine one last time, filled with a strange mixture of regret and resignation. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it, seeming to realize that there was nothing left to say. She signed her name, the scratch of the pen on paper the only sound in the room. Once she finished, she pushed the papers back toward me, her shoulders slumping. So, that's it, then? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. That's it, I said, my tone firm. Robert will handle the details from here. You'll have everything you need by the end of the month. Robert nodded, taking the papers and slipping them into his briefcase. Thank you for your cooperation, Melanie. This will go as smoothly as possible if we stick to the terms. She barely acknowledged him, her gaze fixed on me as if trying to memorize every detail, like someone trying to remember the last moments before everything changed forever. I didn't look away. I wanted her to see the resolve in my eyes, to understand that there was no going back. Once Robert left, I lingered for a moment, letting the silence settle between us. Melanie stood there, as if rooted in place, looking lost, defeated. I thought of the life we'd built together, now shattered, and wondered how much of it had ever been real. Jake, please, she said one last time, her voice breaking. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But don't throw everything away because of one mistake. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of finality. Mel, this wasn't just one mistake. It was months, years, maybe, of lies, of disrespect, of choosing someone else over me, over our family. I paused, my voice dropping to a whisper. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there in the house that had once been our home. It felt strange, walking away from everything I'd known for so long. But there was a kind of relief in it, too. A freedom, a chance to start over. As I stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing, I wouldn't let myself be dragged down by the past. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. There was no point. I'd given Melanie every opportunity to make things right, to come clean, to rebuild what we'd had. She'd chosen to betray me, and now, she would face the consequences alone. In the weeks that followed, the transition was smoother than I'd expected. Robert handled the legalities, and I managed to move out without much trouble. Melanie didn't reach out, and I didn't hear from her again, not until everything was finalized. The house sold quickly, and the proceeds were split according to the terms we'd agreed upon. I took what I needed and left the rest, not wanting any reminders of the life we'd once shared. One evening, as I sat in my new, smaller apartment, I found myself looking through old photos, memories of a life that felt like a distant dream. There were pictures of us at our happiest, vacations, birthdays, quiet nights at home. I wondered if any of it had meant the same to her as it had to me, or if she'd simply grown tired of it all, searching for something new. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret, an urge to reach out, to see if anything could be salvaged. But then I remembered the pain, the lies, the betrayal, and I pushed the thought aside. I knew better than to hold on to something that was already broken beyond repair. In the end, I realized that I didn't hate her. I didn't even feel anger anymore. Just a quiet sadness for what could have been, a life that had slipped through my fingers. And as I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, knowing that I had done everything I could. Maybe, someday, I would find love again. But for now, I was content with the knowledge that I had stood up for myself, that I had taken back control of my life. And as I closed the photo album, I knew that this was the start of something new, a chance to rebuild, to move forward on my own terms. The weeks stretched into months, and slowly, life found a new rhythm. I focused on work, threw myself into new projects, reconnected with old friends, and even found small joys in simple routines. I had thought that, eventually, I'd reach some sort of resolution, that the hollow ache Melanie had left behind would fade, leaving me whole again. But the pain persisted, duller perhaps, but ever present, lingering in quiet moments like a shadow I couldn't shake. One winter evening, after a long day at work, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood near my new apartment. Snow had fallen the night before, coating the streets in a white hush that softened the edges of everything. The crisp air stung my lungs, and I found a strange peace in the solitude. I hadn't felt this calm in ages, not since before I'd found out about Melanie's betrayal. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think of her, wondering where she was and how she'd moved on, if at all. In that moment, I realized that I didn't know how to move on. Every step forward seemed to loop back to memories of our life together, each one tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. And though I had tried, nothing seemed to fill the void. The sadness, as much as I tried to deny it, was still there, woven into the fabric of my life. As I walked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Pulling it out, I saw a text from an unknown number. "Jake, it's Melanie. I know you probably won't want to hear from me, but I have to tell you something. Could we meet? Please." I stood there, staring at the message, feeling a mix of anger, curiosity, and something I didn't want to acknowledge, hope. Against my better judgment, I texted her back, agreeing to meet. She suggested a coffee shop we used to go to on Sundays, a place that held countless memories of lazy mornings and shared laughter. I felt a pang of nostalgia as I agreed, already wondering if I was making a mistake. The next evening, I arrived at the coffee shop early, the weight of the decision heavy in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected, an apology, perhaps, or some last-ditch attempt to reconcile. Part of me didn't even know why I had agreed to see her. Maybe I needed closure, the kind that had eluded me since the day I walked out. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Melanie looked different, thinner, paler, with a quiet sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She managed a faint smile as she sat down across from me, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. We sat in silence for a few moments, the tension thick between us. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know if you would. I nodded, studying her face, trying to understand the mix of emotions that played across her features. What do you want, Mel? She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. I owe you an apology. I know that. I should have apologized a long time ago, but I didn't know how. She paused, swallowing hard. What I did was unforgivable. I betrayed you, and I destroyed everything we had. I know that. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even forgive myself. The bitterness I'd held on to for so long softened just a little as I looked at her, as I heard the sincerity in her voice. But I kept my expression guarded, waiting for her to continue. Jake, she took a shaky breath, tears pooling in her eyes. There's another reason I wanted to see you. I wanted you to hear this from me. A few weeks after you left, I started feeling off. I thought it was just stress, or maybe the fallout from everything that happened between us. But then the symptoms got worse. I started losing weight, feeling tired all the time. Her voice trailed off, and she looked down, as if the weight of what she was about to say was too much to bear. I went to the doctor, and they ran some tests, she said, her voice breaking. They found a tumor, Jake. It's advanced. They don't think there's much they can do. Her words hung in the air between us, cold and final. I stared at her, my mind reeling, struggling to process the weight of what she'd just said. Cancer. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and relentless, refusing to let go. This was not how I'd imagined this meeting. I had come here expecting to confront her, to demand answers, maybe even to find some twisted satisfaction in her remorse. But now, faced with the reality of her suffering, all of that felt hollow and meaningless. I don't know what to say, I murmured, feeling numb, the anger that had once fueled me dissolving into a strange, empty sadness. I'm not asking for anything, she whispered. I know I don't deserve anything from you after what I did. I needed you to know. I wanted you to hear it from me, because I never stopped loving you, Jake. Not even for a second. And now I'll never get the chance to make it right. Tears filled her eyes, and she looked away, her shoulders trembling. I sat there, unable to speak, my mind flooded with memories of the life we had once shared, the love that had once felt so real, so unbreakable. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, there was a part of me that still remembered the woman I had once loved, the woman who had once been my everything. I reached across the table, hesitating before resting my hand on hers. She looked up, surprise flickering in her tear-stained eyes, and for a moment, we sat there, two people bound by a lifetime of memories, of joy and sorrow and everything in between. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Mel, I said, my voice thick with emotion. But I don't hate you. I never did. I just wanted the life we had, the life I thought we were building together. She nodded, her eyes brimming with regret. So did I, Jake. I wish I could go back, change everything, take back all the pain I caused you. But I can't. I can only say I'm sorry, even though it doesn't fix anything. We sat in silence, the weight of her words settling over us like a shroud. I realized that this was the closest thing to closure I would ever get. There would be no happy ending, no neat resolution. Just a shared sadness, a mutual acknowledgement of the love that had once been and the hurt that had taken its place. As we stood to leave, she hesitated, looking at me as if searching for something. Jake, could we spend some time together? Not as a couple, but just, as friends. I don't want to spend what time I have left alone. I felt a pang of sorrow, a deep ache that I couldn't ignore. I knew what it meant to offer her my friendship, to let her back into my life, even in this limited way. It would reopen wounds I had barely begun to heal. But as I looked at her, at the fragility and regret in her eyes, I knew I couldn't turn her away. Yeah, I said quietly, nodding. I think I can do that. In the months that followed, we spent time together, meeting for coffee or walks in the park, sharing memories, even finding moments of laughter in the midst of the sadness. I watched as she grew weaker, as the vibrant woman I had once known faded before my eyes, her illness consuming her day by day. I tried to stay strong, to be the support she needed, even as the pain of what we had lost haunted me. When she passed, it was quiet, a peaceful end to a turbulent life. I was there, holding her hand, letting her know that she wasn't alone, that despite everything, she was loved. In the end, there were no last words, no grand declarations of forgiveness or reconciliation. Just a quiet goodbye, a whispered promise that she would always hold a piece of my heart, a piece of the life we had once dreamed of together. And as I walked away from the hospital that night, I felt the weight of her absence settle over me, a hollow ache that would never quite leave. I had loved her, and she had loved me, in her own way. And though it was too late to mend what had been broken, I found a strange solace in knowing that, even in our last moments, we had found a way to let go.